Okay, I guess I'll begin. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us again on week 2. I didn't scare you guys away, so I appreciate you coming back. Can you all see this screen? Sunni Islam, the victory of traditionism. Yes, thumbs up. Yeah, okay, great. So let's begin. Some quick admin things. First of all, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us. Again, I know you're fasting. 2 hours of lecture, that's a great commitment on your part. Shows your intellectual curiosity, so I appreciate that. The other thing is I did want to extend my thank you to the Ghamidi Center as well, and strongly encourage you to donate to them, just a small donation. And if you could, there's a little bit of background noise that we're getting right now, so if everybody can make sure to mute their audio, that'd be fantastic. Okay. All right. So let's see. Oops. This. Okay. All right. So you can still ask questions in the chat. You can address your questions to everybody. I've figured out how to see the chat screen while I'm using Keynote. But we also want to encourage some video questions. Use the raise hand function. I will call on you. I can lower your hand as well. And make sure to unmute yourself and then mute yourself again after you've asked the question. I really want to make it rewarding for you to actually be joining us live in Zoom and increase that participation. And again, mute yourself and when you're not speaking to prevent that background noise. And continue to please email me feedback. And there's my email address. Again, it's javad_hashmi@mail.harvard.edu. All right, I always like to begin with the principles of religious literacy. I'm not gonna belabor this too much. Again, we're talking about diversity. Religious views change over time. Religious views are tied to culture and context. And we talked about the different modes of religious expression, devotional expression, as well as an academic or non-sectarian study of religion, and also keeping in mind that all knowledge claims are situated, including my own, and you'll clearly see that in this lecture. To review from last week, we talked about the pre-Islamic period. We talked about how this pre-Islamic period was characterized by jahl, which we said was not just ignorance, but also barbarity, impetuousness, being easily excitable, prone to fits of rage and vengeance. The Quran and the Prophet called to hilm or civility, patient perseverance, calmness, and forbearance. The Quran called away from tribal to universal ethics. And the Quran created the individual, but also stressed the social. And the Quranic concept is kind of summarized by this: one God, one origin, one purpose, one end goal, one ummah. And as far as the word ummah, I strongly recommend you to watch the video on my YouTube about inclusivist and exclusivist interpretations of the Quran. So this leads us to the outside resources. I really want you to avail this. This is the lecture 1 deep dive that I've put up. This is on these inclusivist and exclusivist readings of the Quran. So you can subscribe to my YouTube. The URL is a bit odd. That was back in the day when I created a video. I haven't been able to change that URL, but that's how you can subscribe to it. The other thing I wanted you to do is to join this classroom on Google. This way I can communicate with you throughout the week and send some videos and or some minor assignments that are going to be optional. But I do want to have you guys upload YouTube videos and send them to me or send them to the class. These are kind of reflections, and this will be so that you can give your input as well. So if you go to classroom.google.com, all you need to do is click on Join Classroom and put that code in THN, and I'll put it in here. I'll put it in the chat. THN2ID3. And then as far as the slides, I know multiple people have asked me about the slides. That's exactly so that I can send you the slides. I tried to figure out another way to do it, but if you register on classroom.google.com, you do need a Gmail email. So if you don't have one, you're gonna have to set one up, which you should have anyways. Come on, it's 2020. But once you do that, then I'll make sure to upload the slides there. I know people were requesting them, so I'll do that. Okay, make sure there are no questions yet. Okay, great. Let's keep going. And then I also recommend you go to Professor Khalil Andani's YouTube, and you can see my video, my lecture there on jihad. And the reason I send this out is because many of you have asked me about the question of jihad. Okay, so now we will move from the Prophet's time and the pre-Islamic period in the Prophet's time. We're now going to cover the first 200 or 300 years after the Prophet's death. Now I am starting with what we can call Sunni traditionism or traditionalism, depending on how you say that word. I do have certain reservations about starting with Sunni traditionism. This kind of prioritizes a Sunni Islam. We kind of cause that as the default. Really, you could think of history, counterfactual history. In another universe, it's completely possible that Shia Islam would have become the more dominant interpretation of Islam. And the other reason why I'm hesitant to start with Sunni traditionism is it also deprioritizes other forms of Sunni expression, which is what the whole course is about. So with that caveat, I'm still going to start with Sunni traditionism. All right, so the Sunni Shia split, is it socio-political or is it religious, theological in nature? That's a good question to ask. I think it's both. Principle 3 of religious literacy, if you remember, religion is always tied to social and cultural context. I think they are grafted onto each other. So the political drove the religious and the religious drove the political. I do, however, think it seems reasonable to say that the initial split was political and historically incidental, but it quickly took on theological implications. And Umar is asking about how we can join the Google Classroom. That's by putting in that go to class. So I'll put it in. There you go. And class, I think it's classroom.google.com. Okay. So now we're talking about early Islam as far as the Sunni Shia split. One of the problems is our historical sources. Our historical sources for this time period are very problematic. The sources are heavily partisan. The general trend has been to take hadiths and historical reports that are agreed upon by Sunnis and Shias. This is usually how polemical debates go. I think this is historically very problematic. Just because Sunnis and Shias agree on a report does not mean that that actually happened. The tendency on the Sunni side was to have a very kind of open mind toward reports and to interpret away texts instead of, and so as much as possible, there was this tendency, and we'll see why that is, but there was this tendency to try to keep as many texts as possible without rejecting them, but to just interpret them and explain them away. So I think it's problematic to just use this as your methodology. I think the sources are so problematic in this early period that as far as Sunni Shia, the controversy is, I think, at least this is where I fall, you may not agree with this, but I think all that we can do is recount the collective historical memories of the Sunni community and the Shia community. I think it's very hard to say definitively how things went down. The upshot of this, though, I think, is that maybe we can disengage our emotions from these discussions and realize, for example, that the Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Caliph of Sunni Islam, the way Sunnis remember him, is very different than how a Shia would remember him. Just like the Jesus of Christianity is different than the Jesus of Islam, we're almost talking about two different characters, you can say. So maybe that can make us less emotional when we're discussing things. So when a Shia person has a negative portrayal of a companion, maybe we shouldn't get so heated. We could think that, hey, if I had different historical sources or I put emphasis on different events, and I would probably have a different view of this personality. So this is just my personal view on this issue. The general theme of this lecture and the next couple lectures actually will be that after the death of the Prophet in 632 CE, there was a sudden vacuum in socio-political, religious, and spiritual authority. Obviously, the Prophet was the source of all of these three aspects, but after he dies, now the Muslim community has a vacuum. And Muslim groups of virtually all sects, Sunni and Shia, sought to replace and extend prophetic authority in these various aspects. Now, if you had a religious question, you had to say, okay, who do I ask this question to? And this is what the story of Sunni and Shia Islam is going to be. Now, authority in Sunni Islam will eventually break down in this way. Caliphs take political authority. Ulama, or the religious scholars, take religious authority. And Sufis, or mystics, take spiritual authority. However, this takes about 500 years for this breakdown to happen. So we'll see that the picture is a lot more complicated than this. We'll see also in Shia Islam, which, by the way, I had planned on discussing in this lecture, but I realize it's far too much material. So we're going to have to do Shia Islam next lecture so that we make sure not to shortchange it. But we'll see that in Shia Islam, authority, all three aspects of authority are retained in one personality. That is the figure of the Imam. Whereas in Sunni Islam, you see a breakdown of this authority in these three groups. So we're going to talk about that first group, the caliphs. And also, by the way, if you're raising your hand, do me a favor and also just type raise hand in the chat. That will help me as well, because that's front and center in my screen. So after the Prophet's death, there was a succession dispute. I know you all know this. The basics are the Prophet dies in 632 CE. One group takes Abu Bakr, the Prophet's senior companion. He was also the father-in-law of the Prophet, but more importantly, he was a senior companion. This group takes him as the successor to the Prophet. Another group, however, considers Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, to be the more rightful heir to the Prophet's authority. So it's obvious the Sunnis take that first view of Abu Bakr, and the Shias take the second view of Ali. This map, this schematic, will kind of break down Sunni and Shia views. We're going to take a look at this in far more detail in our lecture on Shia Islam. Right now, I just want you to focus on the Sunni Islam branch. So you see that that's the Prophet Muhammad from 570 to 632. After that, the reality is that Abu Bakr does become the first caliph. Now, the only question is whether you consider him a legitimate caliph or an illegitimate caliph. The Sunnis would consider him a legitimate caliph. All right. So you have, and then after Abu Bakr, you had Umar, and then Uthman, and then you had Ali. These four are generally considered the Rashidun, or the rightly guided caliphs. Some people would also include Hassan. Now, his authority was a little bit disputed, but sometimes he's included in this. But there you have the four rightly guided caliphs. After that, it goes to Muawiyah, who is part of the Umayyads, and so is Uthman, by the way. But after this, you have kind of dynastic succession, and that's what's called the Umayyad Caliphate. And then after the Umayyads, I wish I had this had been included in the diagram. Eventually, you'll have the Abbasids. So this is the schematic that you need to keep in mind. What happens on the left-hand side is what is in reality what happens. On the right-hand side, you have the Shia view, where they view that the rightful heir should have been Ali, then after that Hassan, then Hussein, and then their imams. And there's some disagreement amongst various Shia groups about who those imams are, but we're going to talk about that next time. And the reason why you need to have the schematic in mind is I'm going to be constantly referring to, okay, we're now in the Umayyad period, or we're talking about so-and-so caliph. So just keep this in mind. There's Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, and then you have Muawiyah and the Umayyads. And then after that, the Abbasids. Okay. So let's talk about right after the Prophet's death. How is Abu Bakr nominated as the successor? The Sunni sources convey basically the situation as an exigency. That is, there was this situation after there was a power vacuum. Several Arab tribes were now in open revolt. Why were they in open revolt? Well, we can understand. They thought, hey, look, we were into this thing so long as Prophet Muhammad was around. Now he's dead. He was the prophet. We don't really owe any allegiance to anyone else. So we might as well go our different ways. So this was kind of the situation. And in this context, Abu Bakr and Umar, two of the Prophet's companions, basically rushed to make sure that everybody stays united. That's the Sunni view of this early period. So we had, now remember that there were two groups in the Prophet's lifetime, the Muhajirs, those are the immigrants who come from Mecca, and then you have the Ansar, who are the people of Medina, or the helpers. Now the Ansar in Medina, they are intent on nominating one of their own, and they actually have someone in mind, Sa'd ibn Ubadah. Now, Abu Bakr and Umar hear about this and they rush to the scene. And this event is called Saqifa, or it's a portico. I didn't know what a portico is, but basically it's a courtyard. So there was in this courtyard where the Ansar were gathering in order to nominate their own leader. So Abu Bakr and Umar rushed to this scene to stop this from happening, because that would splinter, they feared, the Muslim Ummah. At this time, Abu Bakr offered, he gave two options as far as who to select as caliph, and said, let's go in this direction and let's all unite behind these two figures. Now, Abu Bakr and Umar were of the view that the leaders should not come from the Ansar, but they should come from the Muhajirs of Makkah. They should even come from the tribe of Quraysh. The reason that is given is that there were religious reasons, and there were also socio-political reasons. The socio-political reasons were that the Quraysh were the dominant tribe of Arabia, and if they picked the caliph from this tribe, then the other tribes would go along, whereas if they picked a tribe from the Ansar, that really wouldn't happen. The Ansar replied by suggesting, how about we have one leader from the Ansar and one leader from the Muhajirs, one leader from the Medinans and one leader from the Meccans. Now, I think it's interesting to note this suggestion, because this really shows how the institution of caliph, it's really emerging on the spot on an ad hoc social political basis. So there wasn't this kind of institution of caliph that's on a religious theological level yet. It's kind of emerging as we speak. Now, Umar and Abu Bakr absolutely did not want that to happen, to have two separate leaders. They felt that that would split the Ummah in half, or even more pieces. And so what Umar does is he grabs Abu Bakr's hand and he pledges allegiance to him, and encourages everyone else to do the same. Now, this is, you can kind of think of it, at least in the Sunni conception, is a kind of proto-democratic institution. It is the pre-Islamic institution, by the way, where you had how tribal chiefs were selected. It wasn't a dynastic succession, and it did require that the multiple people to kind of pledge allegiance to one person. Now, of course, it wasn't every single person of the community voting, but it was multiple people buying in to the leadership of whoever was nominated. All right. Okay, so Umar has a great question. Umar's question is, why did the Prophet not lay down a plan of succession after his death? Umar, thank you for the excellent question. So if you ask Sunnis or Shias, you're going to get two different views. And if you're going to ask me as an academic, if I'm wearing my academic hat, I'm going to give you a different view as well. Shias would say, absolutely, it doesn't make sense that the Prophet wouldn't think about, succession is such a big thing. Of course, our Prophet would think of succession and would nominate someone. So that would be the Shia viewpoint. The Sunni viewpoint, well, it differs. You see many different views expressed, but there is this idea that the Prophet kind of signaled that Abu Bakr should be the leader, and he nominated him as the prayer leader, and that was kind of a nod in that direction, and that the Prophet did not want to appoint someone or dictate someone, but allow the Muslims to elect their own person based on the pre-Islamic kind of idea of you needed to nominate your own leader from within yourself. Now, as far as me, if I put my academic hat on, I would say that it's an open question. I would say that I would say that if succession was to be mentioned, I would want to see it in the Quran. Now, you remembered my methodology from lecture 1, where I prioritized the Quran as a quasi-historical text. So from that perspective, I would note the complete absence of any clear text that's nominating anyone. And I would say that it's quite possible that the Prophet died And that was that. There was no mention of succession in the Quran. And I don't think that there's a necessity for that to be the case. So that's my view. We can get into that in more detail later, but let's move on. Okay. All right. All right. So in the Sunni conception, this is all a hasty affair. A falta is the word that they use. So it was an ad hoc basis. They had to rush to move, and that's important from the Sunni conception, because that takes away this kind of premeditated intent of kind of stealing the caliphate away, or the leadership away from Ali. And we're going to talk about that in lecture 2, Ali's claim to the caliphate. All right. And this is Abu Bakr's speech. Before we get into that, we do have a question from Professor Zia, that the Prophet had asked for paper when he realized that the end was near. Umar had negated that move. What is your take on that? Okay, so this is called the Hadith of the paper and pen. What I would reiterate is that I am suspicious and cautious of all of the sources. I'm particularly cautious of sources what are called kind of deathbed pronouncements. So you'll kind of see this throughout Islamic history, that there'll be a lot of scholars will make deathbed pronouncements. So they'll have a certain view that was very controversial, and then it'll be said that on their deathbed, they kind of recanted that view. The reason is because they want to, orthodoxy has this tendency to kind of make sure that everybody's in line. So if somebody said something before, you have to kind of make sure that they rectified themselves near the end. The same is the case with the Prophet. So you'll see there are all sorts of deathbed pronouncements that are put in the Prophet's mouth. So I think we have to be cautious of these. Now I am going to talk about Umar's view as far as hadith and extra Quranic sources. We're going to talk about this in this lecture. So that's the most I'm going to say about the paper and the pen. This is, of course, a very polemical and controversial issue, but that's where I'm going to limit it to right now. And we're going to revisit all of this in the lecture on Shiism, because that's when we're going to get into more narrations about the Prophet appointing someone or not. Hassan Usmani asks, wasn't the Prophet's body in 72 hours before the discussion, and then the mosque ended in Abu Bakr's selection, and Ali was with his body? So yes, Ali was with the Prophet bathing as a close family member. He was bathing the Prophet. As far as the exact time frame, I'm not exactly sure. I do know that it was very soon thereafter that this incident happened, and it's probably controversial about exactly when it happened. So, and I know we have a lot of questions about this, and this is not, this kind of historical thing is not what I'm trying to focus on in this class. It's really the intellectual legacy of the Sunni and Shia, not really trying to arbitrate exactly who should be the caliph after. All right, but here's now the Sunni conception of this nomination. So we have a speech that's attributed to Abu Bakr. Whether he said it or not is irrelevant. The point is, this is kind of how Sunnis are conceptualizing this. So he's basically saying to the Ansar that, look, if we were going to do this based on inherited merits or on kinship, then the Quraysh are closer to the Prophet than the Ansar. However, really, the caliphate, is deserved on account of moral excellence in religion. Taqwa. Remember, this is what we talked about in last week as far as hierarchical communities and how God judges people according to the Quran. So according to this Sunni conception, we're opening up the caliphate to people based on moral excellence. This is kind of how, and now there is kind of some fine nuance to this, because according to the most traditionalist view, it's limited to the Quraysh, although there is some disagreement about that. But this is the point, that they're trying to say that Abu Bakr is the senior companion, he has the most merit, and therefore he makes sense as the leader. All right, so let's talk about this word caliph, which comes from the Arabic word khalif or khalifa. So Khalifa in the Quran is used as in two different ways. One as successor and two as deputy. Now keep in mind, it's not used in the Quran as the way we use it today as a leader of the Muslims. That's not how it's used in the Quran. It's used as God is appointing Adam as his deputy on earth, or it's used in the sense of generations succeed one another. So this is the two ways the word is used in the Quran. Now, according to the traditional narrative, Abu Bakr and Umar, the early caliphs, used the title Khalifat Rasulullah. In fact, this was the title used by Abu Bakr as being the successor of the messenger of God. Now, if you think about this, this is quite a humble title, right? All you're saying is that I am the successor to the messenger of God. There's some distance that's put between you and God. Now, the way the story goes is that after Abu Bakr, once Umar became caliph, he used the title Khalifat Rasulullah, the successor to the successor of the messenger of God. And that eventually this title became too cumbersome, and so we just shortened it to Khalifatullah. That's the traditional narrative. Now, if you are using the word Khalifatullah, that's actually, I would say, a lot more, that title is a lot more grander, right? Because now it can mean God's deputy, right? It's not just a successor, but you're actually God's deputy on earth. And this is clearly how Muslims, the early caliphs, especially by the Umayyad period, early Umayyad period, will start using the term. So we talked about the vacuum of authority that occurred after the Prophet's death. There was the political, religious, and spiritual vacuum. What's clear is that the early caliphs claimed all three of these. Eventually, they'll be whittled down to just political authority, but initially, even the Sunni caliph had political, religious, and spiritual authority of some sort. One of the books that I recommend you to read on this topic is God's Caliph by Crone and Hinz. It's a classic in Western Islamic studies scholarship, but we have certain texts from there that are reproduced. So we have the fifth or the sixth, depending on how you count, but I would say the fifth caliph, Muawiyah, who says, the earth belongs to God and I am the deputy of God on earth. So you see, it's kind of very grandiose, this view. You have another early caliph, Al-Walid II. He writes a letter in which his kind of political theory is explained, and he basically divides the history into the era of the prophets and then the era of the caliphs. But there's a lot of continuity there. So the prophet brought the message, and the caliph is the one who implements or executes it. So we see that this is not too terribly different than the Shia view that views the prophet as the one who brought the message, and Ali being the wasi, the one who implements or executes that message. So here is the letter of Al-Walid II. It's a lot of text. I highlighted some of the important parts, but I'm going to basically just skim it. But we see that God is the one who he deputizes his caliphs over the path of his prophethood. And the caliphs of God are followed one after the other in charge of that which God had caused them to inherit from his prophets. So we see that the inheritance in the view of these early caliphs, they are clearly the inheritors of the prophetic legacy. And we see this continues. We see that the caliphs are actually views that in that early period that put the caliphs above the prophets, but really, for the most part, they put it right at or just below the prophet. The only difference really being that the caliphs are not, they don't get divine revelation, but in all other aspects, they're pretty much right up there with prophets. Now, let's talk about the word sunnah. The term sunnah at this time period, and that's important, right? Because we're talking about Sunni Islam, and Sunni has come from sunnah. The term sunnah was used in a very different way in early Islam. Yes, there was the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, but there was also the sunnah of the rightly guided caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. There was also the Sunnah of earlier prophets. David and Solomon are given as quintessential examples, right? Because they were not only prophets, but they were also kings, they were rulers. So Sunnah is used in all of these aspects. So you'll see that the early caliphs were saying, I'm following the Sunnah of David and Solomon. And you also have the word being used as Sunnah for later caliphs as well. This is a very different conception of Sunnah than just tied to the prophetic Sunnah, which is just referring to the Prophet Muhammad. So we see also in that early period that Sunnah is not coupled to Hadith, or prophetic Hadith, by the way. Sunnah was not seen as some sort of set of concrete rules, but rather as a general example, such as that set by the Prophet according to the Quran. When the Umayyads are said to follow the Sunnah of David, the Prophet, Umar, or later caliphs, the message is that they acted in the spirit of these people, not that they knew actual or specific rulings from them, let alone transmitted from them in Hadith. So, for example, if I said to you, okay, let's say we were conquering a city, and I said, let's follow the Sunnah of Saladin. I don't mean a specific fiqh ruling coming from Saladin. I'm saying that his example of general mercy, and I could say that Sunnah of Saladin is also consistent with the Sunnah of the Prophet when he dealt with the people of Mecca. This is a very different concept than kind of the reified Sunnah or the formalized Sunnah that we think about today most commonly. So, okay. So we have, all right, so let's keep going and then I'll get to questions shortly. So to say that someone followed the Sunnah of the Prophet was to say that he was a good man, not to specify what he had done in concrete or specific terms. Now that leads us to the question, what about Sunnah in the Quran? The word "duh" is mentioned in the Quran 14 times. In 9 of those times, it's the Sunnah of Allah. In 4 of those times, it's Sunnah of the ancients. And by the way, when it's Sunnah of the ancients, that has a negative connotation to it, not a positive connotation to it. And only in 1 time is it mentioned the Sunnah of past messengers, but it's not specific to the Prophet of Islam. And the prophetic Sunnah is mentioned a grand total of 0 times. And even the way Sunnah is used in the Quran, it's not in the sense of a path that one follows, but really it's more used in the context of the way God does things, even especially the way he treats past nations. And this ties in with the concept that Ghamidi Saab calls Itmam-e-Hujjat. This is what this Sunnah is talking about. I don't have time to go into this in more detail. The point, though, is that it's not used in the same way that we use Sunnah today. So we talked about how Sunnah is used in this kind of general sense. So the second caliph, Umar, he had his own Sunnah in which he was not bound by specific rulings of the past, but he was able to articulate his own vision for what he thought Islam, how it should be implemented, how the Quran should be implemented. So we talk about Caliph Umar's reforms. He began the compilation of the Quran into 1 book. Now this happened before his caliphate, but he continued it. He instituted congressional Tarawih prayers, which we're not doing nowadays because of COVID. He banned the slavery of Arabs. He instituted the Walad rule, which was that slave women who gave birth to a child would become free. The child would be free and she would be freed. This is a little bit more controversial because there were then reports that say that the Prophet did it, but there is some evidence that he banned what's called temporary marriage. He instituted a new rule when it came to triple divorce. I think his intent was very different than what eventually the problem became today, but the point is that he was very creative in how he's implementing these rules. He doubled the punishment for public intoxication. Very interestingly, he suspended the had punishment of hand amputation for theft during a famine. And he refused to give zakat to those whose hearts are to be won over as ordained specifically in the Quran. So in the Quran, it talks about who zakat is due for, and it has different groups. One of these groups is those whose hearts are to be won over. The Caliph, Umar, he decided that that was when Islam was in a position of weakness, and now there was no need to divert zakat to these people. Instead, it should be diverted to the poor and the needy. And on that basis, he established a massive welfare and social security program. It's called perhaps the first welfare state. And so these are all from Umar's active engagement with the Quranic ethic, basically. This is how he is implementing this in his day and age. So we have what's called Caliphal law. I think actually at this time it would be a good time to look at some questions. Let's see. Just give me 1 second while I look. Okay, this question is from Umar Arshad. Thank you for the question. If the caliphate is not described in Quran or Sunnah, then why is the caliphate important for Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims? Okay, so I would say that as far as Shia Muslims, we're going to talk about that next week. Shia Muslims have a very different conception. They have the conception of imamate, which is tied with it political rule, caliph, in that sense. But I would separate these two. So we'll talk about Shias next week. As far as Sunni Muslims is concerned, I would say that that there was this general reification of this concept of caliph. And there were different arguments that were raised as to how we should consider the institution of caliphate. But there were different views. So the Mu'tazilis had one view, the other Sunnis had another view. Some said that it was just based on reason alone, aql, that we can say that this is a religious and social necessity, and that the concept of being united is in the Quran, and this is the way of implementing that. And then there are other reports of the Prophet that are also then, whether we take those as historical or not, that are then raised. So there are all sorts of different views that are used to justify this from a religious point of view. All right. Okay, and let me switch back to the previous slide. Okay, so here are Caliph Umar's. So I have another question. This is from Umar Al-Itr. I hope I pronounced your name right. Would all of these rules implemented by Umar be considered bid'ah by current Sunni Muslims? What was the basis for instituting these rules? Okay. And then a very related question by Khurram, which is, are Umar's reforms considered ijtihad on his part, or is it historical back projecting, to use that term today? Excellent questions. Okay, to answer Umar's question, I would say that almost no Sunni mainstream traditionalist Muslim, and I don't use those synonymously, by the way, but I doubt any of them would say that Umar was doing a bid'ah. Bid'ah is a blameworthy innovation. I do know that many Shias view these as any divergences, and they mention this in these books, as blameworthy innovations. But as for a Sunni, that would be anathema to attribute that to Caliph Umar. But I do think that it's a worthwhile question in our minds that wouldn't a lot of these technically be bid'ahs if we did. So let's assume, for example, that Umar had never been suspended the hand amputation. Well, if I was Caliph today and I did that, I think I would get the accusation of doing a blameworthy innovation. But I think then, instead of saying that these are blameworthy innovations, for me at least, the way I interpret it is that there was this interpretive freedom in the early period that is then taken away at a later period. So that's how I take it. But I do see the question as being relevant to how we think about this. Now, as far as Khurram's question about ijtihad, the later tradition is definitely going to say that the reason why Umar was able to do these things was not because he was a caliph, but it was because he was a Sunni jurist in and of himself. That yes, he was a political leader, but he also happened to be adept at fiqh, as it was at that period, or Islamic jurisprudence. I agree with you, though. I think that this is back projecting this onto the previous period. All right, so let's go on. So at this time, we have what's called Caliphal law, which is different than the Islamic or the jurisprudential law that the jurists will formulate, which we'll talk about shortly. Now, what's important to notice is that the caliphs at this time, they are known as, the term Mahdi is within that title of righteous caliph. And many of them in the early caliphs take the term Mahdi, which just means rightly guided. So that's very different than our conception of the Mahdi today. So being Mahdi, the caliphs are strongly associated with justice. Salvation was perceived as coming through the caliph. The caliphs were God's rope on earth. Whoever dies without an imam, that is the caliph, dies a jahili death. And God-given law was formulated by God-given caliphs. So there was this idea of divine right of kings. It was kind of nascent in that early period, but by the early Umayyad period, it definitely is there. So the caliphs were made to understand God's divine intent because God is the one who put them on earth. All right, so we have a question by Reshma. So the Quran was never compiled into one book prior to Caliph Umar's time. When was the order of the surah set, as the Quran does not follow a sequential timeline? So this is a very long answer. I would say that the actual compilation of the Quran as we have it today was actually in the third caliph's time, during Uthman's time, although the process started according to the traditional narrative right after the Prophet's death. So Umar is the one who then told Abu Bakr, who was the caliph at that time, hey, we need to do this thing. But the whole process took some years and was really reached some level of solidification in that third caliph's time. Now, from an academic historical perspective, I can tell you that that's a very rapid period of time if you compare it, for example, to the Bible. All right, so let's move on. So you have the early Umayyad period, in which you have this caliphal law, and then you also have this continued on in the early Abbasid period. Now, keep in mind, simultaneously during this time, you have the rise of the religious, the Ulama class, which we're going to talk about in part 2. Their power is slowly increasing, and now we're going to reach a point in time in which the caliphs are going to really draw their hand, basically. And this happens in the time of the 7th Abbasid caliph, Caliph Ma'mun, who actually supported the Mu'tazila, who were the Islamic rationalists. We're going to talk about the Islamic rationalists in another class and dedicate a whole class to them and the Islamic philosophers. They are a group that kind of died off, but now in the modern period, we see kind of they're inspiring a lot of modern Islamic intellectuals. Now, the Mu'tazila were actually the first theological group in Islam. That surprises many people, but they were the first group. And they actually won the support of the Abbasid caliphs at this time, who then tried to implement that rationalist viewpoint on a specific issue on the Quran. We're going to talk about that later, so I don't want to go into details. But they tried to enforce that by the power of the state. Well, that was a bad idea. That caused a huge backlash, and that backlash is really what made the caliphs lose their standing amongst the masses and reversed the fortunes of Islamic rationalism and really allowed Islamic traditionalists and traditionists, the ulama class, to really gain ascendancy. After that time, basically the office of caliph lost its religious and spiritual charismatic respect, and henceforth the caliph had to satisfy himself with political power. And this should be seen not as a sudden shift, but a gradual shift in religious authority to the ulama. So that took some generations, but really it was this mihna, this inquisition period of state-enforced religious view that kind of was the breaking point. All right, so I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to take some questions now. Now, let me just stop sharing the screen for a second. Is there anyone who wants, let's try this. Let's try asking some questions on video. Does anyone want to raise their hand? I'll take the first question. That's a written question. If you guys want to raise your hand, then I'm going to call on people because I do want to mix it up and get text questions, but also video questions. So you guys raise your hands, and girls, I'm sorry, I have to stop using such gendered language. I apologize. And I'm going to look at some of these questions now. All right. All right, so we asked that. Okay, this is from Imam Muhammad. Thank you for the question. Do you think Sunni culture allows for objective critique on the subject of Umar's reforms? Imam, I think that's a loaded question. I think it's difficult to answer. I would say that the culture in general, our religious culture in general, is not at a point where we can ask critical questions. And this is what Ghamidi Saab faces in Pakistan. I don't know if it's specifically limited to the Sunni subset. I think it would be overall to Muslims. But I think that critical analysis is very difficult to do. Even some of the things that I'm going to say today, I think in other contexts would be very difficult. So on the other hand, the flip side, I would say that many Islamic intellectuals and thinkers are pushing the boundaries, and we are seeing, so I don't want to be all gloom and doom. So I do think that the space is opening up for critical inquiry. Now, whether or not we take a negative or positive view of Umar's reforms, that's another question. I take it in more of a positive sense, but I could see how somebody could take it in a negative sense as well. All right, and then I also had a question. What are these page numbers from on my slides? The page numbers are from the books that in the first time I quoted, I named the book, and then the subsequent ones are all from those pages. And I'm actually going to show those books, most of them, at the end for reading if you're interested. All right, so Uzma has a question. I'm going to ask her to unmute, and please ask your question. Thank you.
Yes, hi Javed. Thank you for yet another very interesting talk. If you would go back to the slide where you showed the reforms that Hazrat Umar introduced, I'd just like to sort of ask a question related to some of the reforms there. Thank you. Okay, let me just. Yeah, so if we see all of these, I think with the a couple of exceptions like the triple divorce and the ban muta, temporary marriage, and maybe instituting congressional Tarawih prayers, the rest, my question is, I create a linkage between let's say the intoxication, the public punishment of intoxication, or the had punishment, or giving out zakat. Isn't there a direct linkage with the Quranic scriptures, which sort of advises the Ummah to stay away from these sins, as is described, pointed out? So I'm curious, why would these be considered bid'ah, if at all? So that's front and center of my mind. And then the whole concept of ijtihad, didn't that sort of was already in the vogue at his time, which is why he then introduced concepts like banning the muta, the triple divorce, and so on? I'm just curious to know what your perception is.
That's a great question. Thank you so much, Osmaya. I really appreciate the question. So what I would say is, first, I would say, and do you mind, I can't lower your hand now, so if someone could lower the hand. Okay, so that's an excellent question. What I would say is this, that I personally don't see these as bid'ahs, because bid'ah has a very negative connotation. It's blameworthy innovations. In my mind, as a Western academic, is really what I am, I consider the concept of bid'ah itself to be a bid'ah, because this is something that the religious orthodoxy does to try to rein in on the, what proper belief. But whether it's positive or negative, so Sunnis generally do not see these as bid'ahs. Again, their view of Umar is far too high for that. And they actually, so what they would kind of respond, I think the traditionalists would be that the Sunnah of the rightly guided caliphs would be right next to the Prophet's Sunnah. So it is you can kind of consider it a mirror of it. So that's how they would kind of deal with that. Now, there are Shia texts that definitely see these things as bid'ahs, as blameworthy innovations. But we have to look at that. There is a certain polemical intent there that we need to keep in mind as well. And if the script was flipped, we would see the same thing. So we see this kind of sectarian partisanship on both sides of, who did it? Okay, that's going to be my view of what it is. Now, as far as I also agree with you that I think that Umar is tying this into his interpretation of the Quran or the Quranic ethos. I see all of them as kind of bending towards this Quranic ethic of justice that even the triple divorce, so even his view on that was intended to stop people from, it backfired, but it was something that was intended to stop people from divorcing their wives and harming them. So I think he was looking at intent of the Quranic discourse and then trying to push it in a certain trajectory. So for example, we have this idea of slavery being bad is only a thing that us moderns can understand, and back then it was nothing bad. I would kind of contest that view. I would see that even at this early period, they're seeing that slavery is something bad, and so they banned it for a subset. And so that's how I would see this. All right, so let's go on to, let me take one more. I hope that answered your question. I know I didn't do it perfect justice, but thank you. All right, let's see. So the question is, how does Sharia law play into this? So we're going to talk about Sharia and Islamic law in part 2. So I hope to circle back to this. But I would say that eventually Caliphal law and Sharia, they kind of part and they go two different ways, and they will exist in parallel with each other. One of them is called siyasa, and the other is this Sharia, which is divested from the caliphs entirely, but that's a historical thing. So let's see who's raised hand. So we have Miss Akhtar, do you mind unmuting? And go ahead, please ask your question.
Okay, so I'm looking at the chart of the Sunni and Shia of the different caliphs and the imams. So if Ali didn't start till 656, what were the Shia doing between that time gap before he was like officially considered an imam? Were they just watching the different reforms going on, or were they coming up with their own different sorts of rules and reforms?
That's an excellent question, Ms. Akhtar. Thank you for asking it. So what I would say is this, from my perspective, we should be hesitant, and I may have fallen into this myself, but I think we should be hesitant to use the word Sunni and Shia at this time. The most we can say, I think, is proto-Sunni and proto-Shia. So these theologies and worldviews, they develop over time. What I would say is that Ali had his supporters at that time, and what they, and according to the Shia collective memory, what they would say is that, they recognize the facts on the ground that the caliph is Abu Bakr. That's a reality, and Umar and then Uthman, but that they were illegitimate, but that Ali, for practical reasons, allowed their rule to stop further fitna or civil war conflict, that sort of thing. So that's the reason why, that's where the Shia, but they wouldn't say that it is legitimate rule. It is rule, it exists, right? But it is not legitimate rule. It's kind of like, you can kind of think of it, some Palestinian activists might say, I recognize Israel exists. That doesn't mean that I think the way it happened was, legitimate the way it happened. It's kind of a similar kind of concept.
Okay,
right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. I think I'm going to move on and then come back. So hopefully if we have time, I just want to make sure that we finish on time. I have to balance questions. So I have Amjad raising his hand. Amjad, please, Mr. Amjad, continue raising your hand so that I can call on you, and don't forget. Thank you. Okay. And really don't want us to get into the Sunni Shia aspect as much, just because I find that so much less interesting than really how these things develop. But I understand that this is a hot topic, so to speak. All right. So we are now, okay. Now, let's talk about Sunnism, right? And by the way, I use the word Sunnism, all right? Why? I know we have this, and we don't like using isms, but I feel like we use Shiism, right? But we should equally use Sunnism. I think prioritizing one over the other, I think that does a disservice, right? Because this is just a historical occurrence that Sunni Islam tended to be the more dominant one. But I don't think that we should, at least as a scholar, I don't want to do that. Now, the Sunni term is just a shortened version of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, right? This is the whole name, all right? And it translates to the people of Sunnah and consensus. But in brackets, I put what type of Sunnah we're talking about. It's the people of prophetic Sunnah and the consensus of the Sunni Ulama. All right, so this is what Sunnism is and what it develops into. Now, obviously, this takes a certain amount of time before this really develops, right? Because I showed you in the early period, Sunnah didn't just mean prophetic Sunnah. And consensus of the ulama, I mean, the power was with the caliphs. Now, not only is it people of the Sunnah, but really it's people of the Hadith. At this early time, we have a group called Ahl Hadith, which is people of Hadith. And these are the people who kind of form the foundation block of Ahl Sunnah. Hadith will become tied with Sunnah. So it's really, what you have is the people of Hadith and Ijma, right? Jama is from Ijma, or consensus. These two ideas, Hadith and Ijma, are the kind of foundation blocks of Sunni Islam. So if you wanted to know what historical Sunni Islam is, it's the people of Hadith and Ijma. And so a lot of our lecture today is going to be talking about these two concepts. Now let's talk about Hadith. Hadith in the Quran. Hadith and its variations, the term, is used 36 times in the Quran. It means speech, narration, story, etc. It has many different meanings. We have in one verse, God has sent down the most beautiful discourse, Hadith, a consistent book. So Hadith here is being used in reference to the Quran, not to the prophetic Sunnah. And it's used like that in many different verses. It's also used for the story, the Hadith of Moses. Have you heard about Moses? Not a single time is Hadith used to refer to the prophetic Hadith as we understand it today. On the other hand, and you might think I'm going down the path of like a Quranist or Quran-only Muslim if you know about certain controversies, but I'm not. It seems natural to assume that the people of that time would have recounted the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad during his lifetime and after his death. If we think about it, if you were in Mr. Ghamidi Saab's circle, and okay, I'm not going to say he passes away, God forbid, but I'm just saying you expect that we then in our congregations and when we're meeting people, we say, okay, Ghamidi Saab said X, Y, and Z, right? That's natural. If it's for somebody like Ghamidi Saab, then how much more so than the Prophet, right? So it's just common sense to say that this would have happened in the earliest time. And we know that the Prophet died the 10 years after Hijrah. We have a report, we have definite reports of certain Hadith collections that happened that we know were formed within 50 years of the Prophet's death. So we have these two that we know existed. Now we don't have extent, they're not existent now, but they were absorbed into later collections that do exist. But what's interesting to note about these Hadith collections is that they include narrations of not just the Prophet, but also the Sahaba and early Muslims, the wise men, basically. So Hadith is not yet tied to simply the Prophet, just as the same way Sunnah is not tied specifically to the Prophet. We also see this early ambivalence towards Hadith, especially when Hadith is used just for the Prophet. There are reports attributed to the Prophet that have him either prohibiting the writing down of Hadiths and others that seem to allow it. Now, how do we reconcile these? The tradition has historically said that the the prohibition was in the early period and then later was abrogated by the later statements. Me personally, again, if I'm putting on the hat of a Western academic, I would say we have to be suspicious about both sides of these reports. And probably these reflect early viewpoints in the Islamic community, Muslim community, where certain people were hesitant towards hadith and others wanted to go with hadith, go down that path. We also note that there was a reluctance to narrate and record hadiths amongst some major companions, including Abu Bakr and Umar, who were the first two caliphs. However, they did record hadiths. At the same time, they also burned collections of hadiths. So we have a report, for example, of Abu Bakr, who compiled a set of hadiths in his lifetime, and then he burned them. So this is something that we have to kind of make sense of. Why is there this kind of ambivalence towards this hadith? The second caliph, Umar, he considered compiling hadith, just like he had the idea of compiling the Quran. He also had the idea, let's compile the prophetic reports, but then he abandoned this project and even banned it. He banned recording hadiths. And there is some good evidence that there was a caliphal ban from the time of the first caliph, Abu Bakr, all the way to the early Umayyad period, a roughly 100-year ban of definitely of writing down hadiths, but also even of narrating hadiths to some extent. And yet, even though we have this, these early caliphs, including Abu Bakr and Umar, are still occasionally referencing prophetic precedent. So how do we balance these two things? And there was definitely a greater reluctance to writing down hadith than narrating them, but there was hesitance with both of these, writing down as well as narrating. So one reason that's commonly given in the tradition is that there was a concern of mixing the Quran with the hadith. And so we wanted the Quran to be completely formulated before we wrote down hadith so that we don't mix the two. However, I don't think it's as simple as that. We have one Hanbali scholar, Khatib al-Baghdadi, who was we're talking about 400 years later. He's now defending hadith's role. He is writing about why there was this early ban on hadith writing. And he says it was for two reasons. So one was definitely to prevent something else from being confused with God's book. But the second point, I think, also needs to be taken into account. There was a fear of taking attention away from the Quran. So we have God's word, we didn't want to take away from it. We didn't want to take away from it with whether it's the prophet's words, the companions' words, the early Muslims' words. There was even a ban on writing other types of holy books. The emphasis was all trying to be on God's book. That's what the intent was. We have sayings attributed to Umar where he says, do you really want a Mishnah like the Mishnah of the Jews? Now the Mishnah is a part of the Talmud. So in Judaism, and I'm clearly no expert of Judaism, but we have the written Torah and we have also what's called the oral Torah. And the Mishnah is part of that oral Torah. So there's this hesitance on Caliph Umar's part, as well as some other companions, that if we write down or if we really focus on these reports, these hadith, then there's a fear that we would create a book alongside the Quran and that would then detract from the Quran. So Umar says, this is attributed to him, I had mentioned putting the Sunan, that's the Sunnah, in writing to you. Afterward, I recalled that some people of the book before you had written a book with which they covered God's book. Then they abandoned God's book. As for me, by God, I will never cover God's book with anything. And so he instituted a ban on anything but the Quran as far as scriptural sayings is concerned. We also have sayings attributed to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Basically the same thing, where somebody comes to him and says, we have this notebook, it has all these wonderful hadith, and then he begins to erase it and says, basically, we should occupy ourselves with the Quran and not occupy ourselves with something else. And then another in the similar narration where he says, do you really think that you have better stories with you than the stories of God, or better hadith than the hadith of God? That is the Quran itself. And we have this view of Abu Musa, another companion, about abandoning the Quran, just as past nations had abandoned the written Torah for the oral Torah. And this is kind of linked to the Quranic verse that they have taken their rabbis and monks as lords apart from God. This is how they understood it. What they didn't really take their rabbis and monks literally as God, as lords with God, but it's because they took their sayings and they put them on par with the word of God. So this was what they did that was wrong, and this is what how these Muslims are understanding it at this early period. So in sum, in early Islamic sources, Sunnah refers to a general example, not a codified set of rules. Sunnah is not limited to the Prophet Muhammad. It included past prophets and caliphs. Hadith collections included sayings of the Prophet, the Sahaba, and early Muslims. Concern about books of Hadith covering the Quran and becoming a Muslim Mishnah or Talmud were there. The early caliphs had a free hand in establishing their own Sunnah and issue their own rulings. Eventually, however, their authority was limited and receded back, and it was limited to the political realm. And they had to cede religious authority to the ulama, or the religious establishment. And that, my friends, brings us to our break. In part 2, we are going to talk about the ulama, and we're going to talk about how hadith and sunnah became linked. And that's what we're going to do. But before we do that, let's get some questions, and then we'll go for break. All right, so let's see. Who has a question? So let's see, participants. Okay, so we have. All right, Amjad, you had a question. Let's see, Amjad, do you want to unmute your mic and tell me, do you still have a question that you'd like to ask? Mr. Amjad? Okay, if you do, just raise your hand again and I'll make sure to call on you next. All right, so I'm gonna call on Usman now. Usman Rizmi, if you wanna unmute your mic and please ask your question, thank you.
I wanted to ask, what does it mean to be traditionalist? As you mentioned, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal is traditionalist. We normally know about there are different legal schools like Hanbali, Shafi'i, and you also mentioned Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal as traditionalist. And Ahle Hadith, traditionalists, Ahle Hadith, and the Hanbali school of thought are the same, or there are some kind of difference?
Thank you so much for that question. And that's a very good tee up for part 2. In part 2, I'm going to go into detail, and that's my fault for kind of mentioning it in part 1 without further explanation. So we have a few terms here. So traditionists is what I use to refer to Ahle Hadith, which is the people of Hadith. These are people who believe that the best way to preserve, kind of understand what Islam is saying is the prophetic reports, or reports in general. Initially, it's reports in general, and then slowly it's then tied to just the personality of the prophets. So these are the people of Hadith, and one of the quintessential or the prototypical leaders of this movement is Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and after him, the Hanbali school of thought is named. But we're going to talk about this in more detail. And I would just point out that these terms are then used again in the modern period, but we should differentiate between them. So when I say traditionist, that's why I'm trying to use that word as opposed to traditionalist, because that's a term kind of reserved for the modern period, where people are trying to link back to our tradition. We'll talk about that in a future class. Similarly, the word Ahle Hadith that's used by a group in the Indian subcontinent and Pakistan, they are using that term because they're trying to take the legacy of this earlier movement in early Islam. So that's why they're using that same terminology. As far as us, though, I mean, as far as me, when I'm putting on my hat again as an academic, I have to differentiate between these two. So that's how I would say it. So when I'm saying it as traditionist, These are people whose job, they are hadith scholars. They are people who are reporting hadiths and spreading them and authenticating them. So these are the Ahle hadith of that time. So that's what I'm referring. But again, we're going to go in more detail in part 2. So, okay, so Usman, if you could lower your hand, that would be great. And then.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And Umar, your question, please go ahead. And tell me how to pronounce your last name, by the way, please.
So it's Elaitr, but you can just call me Omar.
Okay, Omar, sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks for the great information. So my question was, how do many scholars, like current Muslim scholars, claim that some hadiths are legitimate or sahih, when many of them were burnt or banned by Abu Bakr and Umar? I mean, hadith is supposed to be passed down by chain. So I'm kind of wondering how they claim that right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Umar. Excellent question. So what basically the narrative is that the ban was only on written material and not oral transmission. So what they would say to you is that it was preserved, but through oral transmission, and it was only written down once the fear of mixing it with the Quran had gone away. Now, I would contest that a little bit because I see in the early sources, and it's not just me, but many Western scholars do see that there was a hesitance as far as hadith is concerned for more than just this reason. So how they square that away, you know, sometimes the way you justify something from a religious standpoint, you ignore certain facts. So I think that that would be part of it. But that's how they would tie it in. They might also question, they would also point out that there are other reports. And this is the thing with hadith, is that there are always hadiths you can find that can support your viewpoint. So they would point to other hadiths and other reports of Umar, of Abu Bakr, that say, no, these hadiths, and understand them in this particular way. So that they would cite their sources. And that's kind of the story of Islamic history, by the way. Each side kind of brings their hadith to the table. Now, that's not to say that hadith is complete nonsense and that we have no authentication at all, but we're going to talk about that in the second lecture. Does that answer your question somewhat? Okay, thank you so much. And Uzma, we'll take you as the last question, and then we'll go for that break.
My question is, the whole concept of bid'ah, did that pretty much originate with Abdul Wahhab and his movement of Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, or does it have roots earlier than that?
Thank you so much, Ms. Uzma. I appreciate the question. So I would say that it definitely originated much earlier than that. And there are, within the Islamic, what are called the kind of the canonical sources, and we're going to talk about what we mean canon. The term bid'ah definitely does appear in them. So it's not Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab who originated it. He is somebody who did kind of emphasize it and bring it into this modern context in a very controversial way. And that leads me to another kind of thing. Sorry, you can kind of hear my dog in the background. I apologize. But that leads me to another issue, which is that we shouldn't lay all blame on Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, which is a tendency of many people today who are more kind of liberal reform minded, which I appreciate, but I think it oversimplifies things if we just kind of attribute everything to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab or the Wahhabis. So I do take your point that definitely he's the one who kind of brought it back into the limelight, but he's definitely not the one who originated it, and they're definitely not the only group who emphasizes it. So that is it for me as far as that answer, and no other questions here. Imam Muhammad has two small questions. Why don't you ask, would you, Muhammad, Imam, would you like to ask that right now, or do you want to ask that in the chat box?
I could ask. I only had one question. I think there's two Muhammad Alis here apparently. So I only had one question.
Okay. Oh, that must be very confusing to the other person who is calling Imam. So please go ahead.
So my question is, do you know of any evidence of differences of opinion within the Ummah in general about sort of the value of the word of the Prophet? beyond the Quran, the debates that existed around that.
Yes.
If it did exist.
Yes, thank you so much, Imam Muhammad, for that. There is definitely evidence of that, and we're going to get to a lot of that in part 2, and then I can point you to other resources as well after that. But I'll point you in some directions in part 2.
So appreciate it.
As well as in the deep dive, I think I'm going to go into that as even more depth. So that's why I strongly urge everybody to please subscribe to the YouTube so you're not missing out on that content. Salman, let's go to the break, and then, unless it's a very quick question, because we need to do part 2. So Salman, go. Yep, sorry.
The other Muhammad Ali has had his hand up for a really long time. Can we invite him to ask his question?
Yes, please. And it might have been because I mistook him for the other one. So let's do that, and then we'll take Salman's question. But I do want to get into part 2. But go ahead, please.
Jawad, I have 2 small questions. Sorry for the confusion. My first question is: don't you think there are exceptions to every law? Umar's decision to cut off hand was due to famine. So there has to be some exceptions to every law. If you are going to the court and if a judge feels you have, been through a lot, they give you a compensation. And my second question is about celebrating Prophet's birthday. Some people consider it a good bidah, but other people won't give them the space. So how do we cater between these 2 things?
Thank you so much for your 2 questions. All I would say is that these are, so I'm trying to give this talk and put my academic hat on. So I'm trying not to weigh in on religious issues. To answer your first question, I think if I had to, I would say, yes, you're absolutely right. There should be exceptions, right? It seems to me to make sense that you would not want to be an absolutist on anything. And to give credit where credit is due, even the Islamic tradition has all sorts of conditions and all of this kind of thing. So I agree with you on that. As far as the Prophet's birthday is concerned, again, I don't want to weigh in on either way, just because that would, I think, introduce a little bit of bias. But I would say that, yes, some people would consider that an okay, quote unquote, innovation, and others would consider that a blameworthy innovation. And some people would be of such a view that there is no such thing as a good innovation. And that in itself is a huge debate. But I think that would really bring us to the modern period. Maybe we can circle back to some of these things. I do think we need to take that break. So let's take that break and come back in 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, guys? So I'll see you then. And Salman, we'll have to, Salman, if you want to text me, you can either do it privately, and then I can see when I can plug your question, and I can even call on you at that point in time. But we do need to move on because of part 2. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I'm back here just to answer any extra questions someone might have. This is before we actually resume, so feel free if you wanted to ask any questions, informal, even if you wanted, that's fine. But this is kind of our break, so you don't have any obligation to. And I know Salman had a question if he's still here, but he might not be.
Javad, it's Susma again. I just have a question on the slide deck from last week. Is that something that the participants will be getting a copy of that?
Yes, I wanted to send those out, but I didn't have any real way to do it. So did you see when I talked about the Google Classroom? And I can put that back up.
No, I think I was just a few minutes late before joining.
That's okay. So I'll go back to that. Hold on. Can you see? Oh, you're not seeing my. Are you seeing my screen right now or not?
Yep, I am.
Okay. All right. So right there. So classroom.google.com, and you'll join the classroom, and then you'll put that code in, and that will. And then I'm going to upload it to. Right now, there's not anything there, but I will upload that soon.
Okay, so let me just jot down the code.
Okay, and then I'm going to answer Salman's question right now. Unless Uzma, did you have anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, appreciate it. So that's a great question. So Salman asked, from an academic perspective, how do you look at the collection and preservation of the Quran? You mentioned that it started coming into its current shape and form order-wise in the third caliph's time. Are we dubious about the Quran from an academic perspective? So I would say quite the opposite. And so the traditional narrative, to be clear, is that the process started in the Abu Bakr's time. And Umar is the one who kind of gave him that idea. That's according to the traditional narrative. And then it kind of really reached a collected form in Uthman's time. But from an academic perspective, I think we've swung from extreme skepticism and revisionism. That was in kind of the 1970s. And now the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction. And the reason is that we had, because during that time, we didn't even know if the Quran was revealed in the Hijaz, which is Mecca, Medina area, was in the Prophet's lifetime or not. But since that time, we've had manuscript evidence that reinforces the traditional view. And then we also have certain other evidence. They're called Quranic variants. But all of this has led us to come closer to the traditional view. I don't think it is 100% in line with the traditional view. And there are certain places where I have to take a divergence. But for the most part, I would say that if you were comparing that extreme revisionism on the one side and the traditional view, I would say the traditional view is closer to getting it right from an academic historical perspective. And the other thing I would say is what we can say with a great deal of certainty, and this is part of my methodology, in fact, is to rely on the Quran because we know that it became a closed text early on. So it doesn't have historical anachronisms, for example, and that helps us know that it probably is to the time it was. All right, so thanks for the question. And let's start back again. I apologize for giving a shorter break, but so many questions, good questions that I wanted to do. So I'm gonna skim through all my slides. All right, we're almost there. So we'll give a chance to people to join back as well. Okay. And please do make sure to go and donate a little bit. This class is free. I volunteered to this class, or I was asked to teach this class, and I said yes to it. And I did not, I knew in the back of my head how much work it is, but it's quite a lot of work. This is being offered free to you. So if you donate to the Ghamidi Center, that would be very much appreciated. Okay. In part two, we're going to talk about the Ulama. So part one was the caliphs. Part two is the Ulama, which is the religious class. Let me just rearrange something. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so we all have heard this term madhab. What does it mean? Well, originally madhab just meant a particular opinion of a scholar. So if you're reading, I remember when I first started reading Arabic, I was confused. I was like, why are they saying this is a madhab of somebody when they're just voicing an opinion? Well, that's what it meant at that time. It only eventually took on that kind of meaning that it stood for all of the views that a specific person had, and then it became like a personal school, and eventually it came to denote a doctrinal school that multiple scholars shared in their methodology. So these are the legal schools of Islamic law. There's the Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, and Shafi'i madhabs that are most famous, and these are the surviving ones. But it's important to note that there were dozens, if not hundreds, of other madhabs that died out. Many of these were personal schools. Some of them, I think you could say, were kind of doctrinal schools as well. But really, these are the four that kind of stood the test of time. And that's why we think of these four when we think of them. It's also important to note that they're named after their what's called the eponymous founder. That is, Abu Hanifa is said to be the founder of the madhab. But it would be incorrect to think that all you need to do is know what Abu Hanifa said about something, and that's the view of the Hanafi madhab. That's not really how it works. These are just named after what are considered the most influential figure in their early period, but they were codified over long periods of time. So just because Abu Hanifa said something doesn't mean that's what the Hanafi madhab says about that thing. So that's important to keep in mind. And even in the Hanafi school, for example, there were two of his disciples who were just as influential in creating the Hanafi madhab and equally could have been named after them. It's also important to note that these madhabs, these legal schools, they developed based on geographical distribution initially. And we'll talk about that as we go on. So let's talk about the Maliki school that was named after Imam Malik. There you see his date when he lived. The first date is the AD CE, what we use today, and then the second date, the 93 to 179, is after Hijrah. That helps you think about how long after the Prophet this is going on. Okay, it's important to note that in this early period, law did not primarily derive from the reports about the Prophet, that is the Hadith. Now I'm going to use this word proto-Maliki as well, right? Because this is early period. They followed something called the actions of the people of Medina, the Amal Ahl al-Madina, all right? Basically, this is what we can consider the lived tradition of the people of Medina. The idea was that the Prophet lived in Medina for much of his prophetic mission, and that the people who lived in Medina, especially the scholars and the wise people, they were following his Sunnah. Now, Sunnah is not used in the sense of it being linked to a specific Hadith report, but instead it's used in the sense of this lived tradition. So for example, people ask, how do we pray? Well, how did you learn how to pray? You learned from your parents who taught you how to pray. Your parents learned it from their parents. Their parents learned it from their parents, and so on. Similarly, there was this idea in the early period that we pass along these rituals and ideas, and that's the lived tradition, and this is following the prophetic, or just the Sunnah at this time. It's more of a general term that does incorporate the Prophet, but is more expansive than that as well. And it was felt that this is better than following this kind of community practice of the Prophet's own people is probably a better bet than just following a one-off hadith that may or may not be authentic and that is just talking about one snippet of time. So it was felt that this was probably a better guide. Now, even though this was the case, Imam Malik did then write his book Al-Muwatta, which means the well-trodden path, in which he took all of these views, these practices of the people of Medina, and compiled them and to make kind of a cohesive vision of what ritual and belief in Islam should be like. These did include prophetic reports, but it also included non-prophetic reports, reports of the Sahaba and the early Medinan scholars as well. Now, it's important to note that by writing this book, Imam Malik is actually putting the first nail in the coffin of his own school, because we're going to go from a lived tradition to a text. And we'll see how that will kind of transform the Maliki school with time. And this was a quote used by Imam Malik at that time in one of his books. He writes, "The Prophet and the holders of authority after him established traditions, sunan. To adhere to them means conforming to the book of God, perfecting one's obedience to him. That is to say, Sunnah is not just tied to the prophets, but it's tied to more than just the prophets. It's definitely consistent with prophetic practice, but it's not limited to just him." So we have this quote from Professor Shamsi's book, which I'll link to at the end. So we see, and it's highlighted, the Quran and the prophetic example, the Sunnah, in this conception are not removed closed sources that should be followed in the way that a cookbook is followed. Rather, the Quran functions as the ultimate justification for following a continuous tradition, Sunnah, that, though established by the Prophet Muhammad, was complemented by the leaders of the community who succeeded him. Tradition is thereby cumulative. It is living. So you had the Malikis who were in Medina. Then you had the Hanafis who were in mostly Iraq, modern day Iraq. And these were people who were known as Ahl al-Rai, that is the people of opinion or reasoned opinion. That word has been interpreted variously as common sense, rationalism, or legal or reasoned opinion. Imam Abu Hanifa is the eponymous founder of this school. And it's important to note also that many of the Hanafis were Mu'tazilis. That is, they were Islamic rationalists. We'll talk about this group of people in a future class, but they were people basically who put a premium on human reasoning. They believed that human reason was a God-given thing and we should use it and embrace it. So these people, the people of opinion, based their view on the idea that the companions and the Prophet themselves engaged in legal reasoning. So this was one of the questions that I was asked about Umar, the Caliph, doing Ijtihad. This is kind of that similar idea. They're seeing that the companions of the Prophet engaged in this process, so surely we should be allowed to do this as well. This was also a dialogic or a dialectical discourse. So it was two people debating with each other and discoursing with each other. So this was how they came to legal rulings. So one scholar would say, this is what I think about an issue. And then another scholar would try to poke holes in it. And this way they would kind of refine their thinking. They would also use analogical reasoning or qiyas. So they would say, for example, that this certain thing, and the common example we use today, of course, is not back then, but we say, okay, alcohol is prohibited. What about marijuana? Well, marijuana also intoxicates in that same way. It befuddles the mind. So therefore, it should also be prohibited. So this is kind of analogical reasoning. So this is what this school of thought used. And again, this is what I said earlier, that they believe that God had imbued human beings with aql, reasoning, rationality, common sense, which was a better guide to truth than isolated, unverifiable reports. They also relied, just like the Malikis, they also relied on local Iraqi practice based on the idea that prophetic companions also settled there, and they were the carriers of this prophetic tradition and the example. So there was also this local idea amongst the Hanafis of Iraq as well. So this was the Maliki and Hanafi approach to hadith. They did not discard hadith completely, right? But they did say that hadith, and even prophetic hadith, was just one data point amongst many others. If a hadith conformed to local, customary, and acceptable practice and widely accepted principles, then it was accepted. An example of this would be the widely accepted principle, which is enshrined in a prophetic hadith, that states that when liability comes, the entitlement to profit is also there. This is a legal maxim. Basically, it's saying that, look, if you take on the risk, you should get the reward. So if you invest in something, if you invest in Google shares and Google crashes, then that you lose out money. But if Google goes gangbusters, then you get the profit. That's all it's saying. So if you take on the risk, you should reap the reward. The reason why I give this example is there is an example of a prophetic hadith. There's a hadith attributed to the Prophet in which there's a specific case in which you buy a cow and the cow doesn't give you the milk that you wanted. Then the seller owes you certain money because he sold you a defective product. Well, the Hanafi said in this example, no, because with liability comes profit. So they took this general legal maxim, which is enshrined in the hadith, and they took this, even though it differed with a specific case example that's also attributed in a solitary hadith. They thought the former was something stronger to hold on to than the latter. So they used widely accepted reports, especially those that contain maxim-like rules. And they also knew that the majority of hadiths were solitary and one-offs, and thus they did not play a major role in their dialectical debates. That's at least the Hanafis, by the way. Now, this is going to lead to a historically negative view of reason in what becomes traditionist Islam, which becomes then what we now today consider quote unquote mainstream Islam. The reason is that there was a fear that all of this dialectical, this debating developed into a multiplicity of viewpoints. Everyone was voicing their own opinions. Now, Imam Shafi'i is going to be the one who's going to be kind of the victor. He's going to basically win the debate for the Ahl Hadith side. And he is going to spend some time in Iraq, which was the Abbasid capital at this time. And he noted these theological and philosophical debates that are taking place in the kingly court. These disturb him greatly. Now, we're going to cover some of these groups that are doing these debates in the court in a future course. So you can obviously see that I have a very positive view of these groups. But Imam Shafi'i is seeing these, and he's concerned that these are going to fracture the Muslim community. He also thinks that these will cause a disdain for prophetic reports. We have a disdain for what is transmitted to us in revelation and in revelatory text. Now, an example is, there's this example where someone is asking someone else, what happens, what kind of financial restitution do you get if you are injured if you lose one finger? Well, the person who injures you has to give you 10 camels. What about 2 fingers? 20 camels. What about 3 fingers? 30 camels. What about 44 fingers? Not 40 fingers. You'd have a problem if that was the case. But then you get 20 camels. So then the person asks, wait, that doesn't make sense. I lose 4 fingers and I get less than somebody who gets 3 fingers? Well, the person responds that, no, yes, that's the case, because we know in a prophetic report that if you lose the hand, you lose 20 camels or 4 fingers. So we stick to that. We don't care, we don't use our logical reasoning here. No, we follow what's called firm proofs. So there's this kind of idea of naql, which is text, over aql, which is reasoning and rationality. So the group that really spearheads this idea that we follow text as opposed to reason are the Ahl al-Hadith, which is led by Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who the Hanbali school of thought is named after. They believe that human reason is too subjective and therefore it is dangerous. Instead, we should follow hadith, even if they are isolated, weak hadith. That's better than following one's own reasoning. So we can summarize that the madhabs, the legal schools, looked like something like this in the early period. We had the Malikis, who focused on lived tradition. We had the Hanafis, who focused on human reason, aql. We had the Hanbalis, who focused on hadith, or text, naql. All right, this is what the situation looked like. And in fact, in this early period, the Hanbalis were the minority. Ahl Hadith were the minority, kind of on the outs at this point in time. But then came Imam Shafi'i. Now, we cannot underestimate how important Imam Shafi'i is to Islamic law, and from there to all of Islamic intellectual thought and outgrowth. He is the one who codifies Islamic law, and everyone will follow him after him. So he studies under Imam Malik. He studies under one of Imam Abu Hanifa's students, who, by the way, what the school could have been named after. And he also studies with Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So you see now, he's studying with all 3 groups. So guess what he's going to do? He's going to join all of these. He's going to synthesize all of this. So he does what's called the great synthesis. He formulates the famous 4 sources of Islamic law that you've probably heard of. We're going to look at the next slide to talk about what those 4 sources are. Well, what's important to note is that he is the one who is most successful in restricting hadith to the Prophet and elevating it to the level of nas, or scripture, or canon, scriptural canon, alongside the Quran. He was basically a traditionist, a follower of Ahl Hadith, and he fought off the hadith skeptics. So here are the 4 sources of Islamic law. There's the Quran, there's the Sunnah, which is number 2, but really we're tying the Sunnah here to the hadith. The hadith is the carrier of the Sunnah. It's the way we know the Sunnah, according to this view. The 3rd source is ijma, or consensus, or sometimes is listed as the 4th one. But what's important to note is in this formulation, ijma is not generative. It is only confirmatory. That is, you might take a view, and a modernist scholar, Allama Iqbal, will try to take ijma in this direction. And there's evidence that people did in the early period as well, where ijma is this kind of progressive institution where you're able to enact new laws by just saying, okay, let's all reach a consensus and come up with the law. Imam Shafi'i is saying, and the people who follow him are not going in that direction. They're basically just using ijma to bring, to stabilize already existing views that are generated from the Quran and the Sunnah and from the fourth source, which is qiyas. So ijma, in their view, is more of a conservative institution than a progressive one. And finally, you have qiyas, which is analogy. So keep in mind the people of opinion, they had an expansive view of reason, especially the Mu'tazilis and is the Islamic rationalists and philosophers. Imam Shafi'i knows that the Ahl Hadith are really getting kind of their butts handed to them when they go into debate because they don't believe in any form of reasoning. So what Imam Shafi'i does is he says, no, let's enter in reasoning, but let's restrict it to a very restricted form of qiyas. So this then becomes the four sources of Islamic law that we now know of today. Imam Shafi'i also introduced or developed at least other tools such as abrogation and particularization or specification, takhsis, and naskh is what abrogation is, in order to basically, we had all of these hadiths. Many of them seem contradictory, or at least apparently contradictory. How do we reconcile them? That was actually an argument used by the Malikis and the Hanafis to say, hey, we can't rely on hadiths, they're all contradictory. So Imam Shafi'i is introducing these tools in order to say, no, we still use the hadiths, but this is how we decide between them. We use these two tools. What Imam Shafi'i is doing is he's prioritizing the Quran, but really more so the Sunnah as understood as the hadith, including single transmitter hadith reports, while excluding local or lived practice. So we go from local and lived practice to universal and fixed canon or scriptural canon. That's really the movement that happens after Imam Shafi'i. Now, there is a certain appeal to this, right? If we're all following our localized practices, the Ummah is not really united. So this is what Imam Shafi'i is doing. He's saying that's way too subjective. Let's move toward this kind of universal and fixed view of religious practice. So his view is that when the Quran and Sunnah are present, no other source should be consulted. He elevated the hadith to the level of scripture, that's textual canon alongside, or practically speaking, above the Quran. We'll talk about why that is. And he is of the view, that, and this view develops then, that we have this view that the Quran is wahi, which is divine revelation. But now, oh, I'm sorry, this is a big typo. This should say hadith, sorry. Hadith is wahi. Quran is wahi, and Quran is wahi ghair al-matlu, meaning unrecited revelation. So I apologize, that's a horrible typo there. Now, if you wanted to read a little bit more about this, and Imam Muhammad had the question, one place that you can start is this book by Aisha Musa, where she talks about hadith as scripture. This is the process where hadith is elevated to this level, and that's done by Imam Shafi'i. And we see in Imam Shafi'i's debating that he's dealing with people who are not agreeing with this view, who are kind of a hadith skeptical at this time. Some who completely reject hadith, but most of them who basically want to limit hadith to a very kind of subsidiary role than the role that Imam Shafi'i sees for it. So after Imam Shafi'i, we see that gone was this existential certainty of being part of this kind of organic stream of normative lived tradition that flows from the prophetic time to the present. Instead, now you have this kind of distance that's created between the present generation and the prophet's time, which is now cut off and can only be accessed through hadith and textual reports, basically. So I'm going to just go through a couple more slides, and then I'll take the question. I do see the raised hand. Thank you. So why was Imam Shafi'i so successful? He gave the Ahl Hadith the legal tools and reasoning to combat and defeat the people of opinion, the rationalists. Ahmad ibn Hanbal said our napes, that is our necks, the back of our necks, as Ashab al-Hadith, which is another term for Ahl Hadith, our necks were in the hands of Abu Hanifa, and they were not wrested away until we saw al-Shafi'i. That is, Imam Shafi'i gave them kind of the ammunition that they needed. And the other thing was the mihna, or the Inquisition, was one reason for the success of the traditionists and the defeat of the rationalists. Keep in mind that one of the people that was jailed at that time was Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal himself. And he became a hero and an icon after that because he was jailed and he refused to submit to the caliph. And he refused to submit to kind of religious compulsion on this issue. So no matter what view we take on this issue, I think we can at least respect the fact that he stuck to his guns, and we see that forcing your view through the state actually backfired. After Imam Shafi'i, his synthesis was so successful that we see that all four madhabs, all four legal schools were drawn to each other. They gravitated towards each other. And you see that Imam Shafi'i's sort of legal thinking, it will find its way into even the Hanafi and Maliki schools, as well as the Hanbali school. So the Hanbalis, they went on to go accept qiyas to a limited extent, and ijma to a limited extent. The Malikis and the Hanafis, they started to accept hadith. And one of the reasons this happened was that they were entering into debates with the Shafi'is, who became very prominent. The Shafi'is also then got state sponsorship. So the Malikis and the Hanafis are in debates with these Shafi'is, and they have to justify themselves. And what they do is they say, okay, we have this, we have this practice. We're debating about a certain practice. Now, the Shafi'is don't accept lived tradition, right? So a Maliki cannot then say, well, this is our lived tradition, that's why we should accept it. No, a Maliki will have to say, yes, it is a lived tradition, but we can also find it in a hadith report, and this is why we do it. A Hanafi similarly would be forced to come to a common ground with the Shafi'i and say that, okay, yes, this practice of ours goes against this hadith report, but there's another hadith report that goes along with our practice. So you see that in debating the Shafi'is, these other schools are actually gravitating towards the Shafi'i view, and eventually they absorb it. Even the Mu'tazilis, who are kind of a hadith cautious or skeptical group, find themselves inevitably going towards hadith. So that's my next point, that basically nobody could resist the temptation of just ending a debate by using those ever so helpful words, Qala Rasulullah, that is the messenger of God said. That was kind of a debate stopper. Hadiths thus became the defining feature of Islamic law, and Islamic law in turn became the defining feature of Sunni Islam. The other thing that we had happen was that the Mu'tazilis, we're going to talk about them in a future class, they were the Islamic rationalists. They, again, remember, they had a high view of the human intellect to discern good from bad. They basically receded to the background. The Ahl Hadith were the ones who said, no, we need textual reports. They are basically become triumphant with Imam Shafi'i's synthesis. The other thing is that there is a group, the Ash'aris, we're going to talk about them in the future. They're a theological group. They basically try to strike a middle ground between Mu'tazilis and Ahl Hadith. But when they strike this middle ground, they basically take the wind from the sails of the Mu'tazilis. And they really reject the Mu'tazili view of human reason, and they say that whatever God says is just and right. If that's the case, then you don't need to use your aql, because you just need to see what God says, and that will let you know what proper normative practice is. We're going to talk about this in more depth. The only reason I'm mentioning it here is that you cannot discount the rise of Ash'arism as in the success of the Ahl Hadith. Even though the Ahl Hadith will hold on to their view of theology, and that's going to be called Hanbali theology or Athari theology, the success of Ash'ari theology is one of the reasons that the rationalists will eventually die out. But this is, again, we're talking about 400, 500 years after the prophets. So Ash'arism becomes the established orthodoxy of theology, and the Mu'tazilis fade away. What happens in the end is the victory of traditionism. That is, human reason and opinion were seen to be too subjective, whimsical, and dangerous, resulting in the splintering of the ummah. With the passage of time, these scholars, okay, this is a quote about the early period. Basically, scholars, they came to call for the placement of greater emphasis on the hadith ascribed to the Prophet. Hadith were thus connected with the concept of Sunnah. There were many figures, including the Prophet Muhammad, his companions, and the followers, whose views the earliest Muslim scholars considered authoritative to some degree. However, the demand sprang up for special emphasis to be given to the hadith of the Prophet. And we can understand this as a result of this impulse towards uniformity. If we have one single authority, hopefully we would only have one single religious answer. Now, of course, there's the issue of hadith forgery. Every side would forge its own hadith. So you had all these contradictory hadiths. Now, you can tell that I am from, again, I'm putting on my Western academic hat. I do come from, if not skeptical, cautious view towards hadith. But as a Western academic, I cannot say that the hadith authentication system is completely hooey, that it's all made up, it's all imaginary. People were just forging left and right. Yes, forgeries were definitely there, but I don't want to discount it completely. Clearly, the evidence has pointed us in the opposite direction, that they were scholars who were trying to sift the real from the fake. The question is, does the hadith enterprise successfully sift the real from the forged, or has the horse already left the barn? That answer, or that question, I leave up to you. All I would say is that even the hadith that is considered the most, it's considered one of the most mutawatir, that is mass transmitted hadiths in Bukhari and Muslim. Whoever attributes to me what I did not say, let him take a seat in hellfire. If we use the historical critical method that we talked about in lecture 1, I would say we'd have to be very suspicious of this report. Why? Because it's talking about a problem that clearly came up later, where people were forging hadiths left and right. So I do end on a note of caution, but that's not a view that you necessarily need to agree with. Finally, and I'm reaching the end, and then we're going to take questions. I have to push off questions to the end. I do refer you to a book by Behnam Siddiqui. Behnam Siddiqui is a professor. He is honestly one of the premier scholars of Quranic studies today, but he has a book on Islamic law as well. I strongly urge you to read this book, The Logic of Lawmaking in Islam, Women and Prayer in the Legal Tradition. The reason is I want to complicate our picture a little bit more. So I told you in this lecture that hadith became the building block of Islamic law. Why? First of all, let's talk about why that is. The reason is the Quran is a very relatively small book, and its legal verses are very few, and its specific legal verses are even very few. So if you pick up any book of Islamic law or jurisprudence that is a fiqh book, you'll see that its building blocks, it's basically full of hadiths, each side kind of showing its hadiths for its particular viewpoint. And you'll see that the hadith is very specific and particular. If you have a fiqh question, the hadith will give you like a direct answer to it. Whereas that's not the case with the Quran. In fact, if you eliminated the Quran entirely, I would argue that your fiqh book would stand that test. It would continue to make a lot of sense. But if you remove the hadith, I think fiqh would fall apart. That's why I say that hadith becomes the building block of Islamic law. Behnam Siddiqui, however, complicates this further. He argues that even hadith, we shouldn't overemphasize hadith in the sense that Islamic law sometimes operates beyond just what we call textual reports. And he talks about how there are, for example, hadith that talk about how, and we all have probably heard of these, that do not stop God's handmaidens from going to prayer. That is, don't stop women from going to the mosque. Yet, the Hanafi school, even today, prohibits women from going to the mosque, or at least strongly discourages it. So you'll see that in most mosques in Pakistan, there's no women's section there. Why is that the case? How did Islamic law develop in this way? I realize I'm not going to be able to get into this topic in this lecture due to time. So what I'll do is I'll make a deep dive video on this. So that's why, again, I'm putting my plug in for you to subscribe to my YouTube. I'll put a deep dive where we'll talk about women joining men in congregation, praying next to men. Why is it that women have to pray behind men? We'll see how the logic behind why women have to pray behind men actually changes with time, even though the ruling stays the same. So we'll talk about that. And lastly, we'll even talk about women leading prayer. And all of this is based on Behnam Siddiqui's amazing work on this topic. All right. So bottom line is, I think we can say that even though there's a lot of problems that I see with the external kind of foundations of Islamic law, I still want to say that we cannot deny that the fiqh paradigm, this Islamic jurisprudence or law paradigm that was created over time, it is an impressive and internally systematic body of knowledge. that at most we can't completely poo-poo it. I think we would be we would be very misled if we do that. It's obviously an impressive body of knowledge that we have to reckon with and that we have to take seriously. And it is what allowed the ulama, or our religious clerics, to become a semi-independent body and become the fountainhead of Islamic religious learning. They did become semi-independent or even independent. That is, they were separate from the caliphs. And this is kind of something that's very positive. They were not dictated to, that they actually were displayed this independence of thought, which is something admirable, I think. And they also became a transnational body of scholars, right? Because after Imam Shafi'i became successful, he made it so now local practice was not so important. Instead, you now have all of these scholars from all these different areas united by the same source texts and united also by their shared doctrinal methodologies. So you see that ulama from one country can easily talk to ulama from another country, and that exists to this day. Finally, my bottom line point of this was that you see the extension of the Prophet's religious authority. We said the caliphs eventually took just the political realm. Well, the ulama, they become the heirs of the Prophet in the religious realm. And of course, they have a hadith to back that up. The scholars are the heirs of the prophets. So I just have a couple more slides and then I'm all done. So I want to stress this point that the hadith becomes paramount in Sunni Islam. And we see a quote from Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal in which he says this, that the Sunnah indicates the meaning of the Quran, right? And by Sunnah, he means the hadith. Shafi'i had rejected the idea that hadith can abrogate the Quran, but in practice, he actually does do this, right? Think of stoning. Stoning is not in the Quran, it's in the hadith, but that will take precedence even in Imam Shafi'i's own mind. And a further Shafi'i scholar will say, no, in fact, the Sunnah, the hadith can abrogate the Quran. And we have this legal maxim, this is in Sunni Islam in general, that the Sunnah, and here the Sunnah is understood as the hadith, is the judge over the Quran and not the Quran over the Sunnah. And the reason is very obvious. The Quran is very general and vague at many points. The hadith is very, very specific, incredibly specific. Like it'll tell you if you buy a certain number of dates, for example, what happens, or how many, this type of camel or that type of camel. So if you had a general text or a specific text, which one would you rely on? You'd obviously rely on the specific one because that tells you exactly what to do and you wouldn't have to use your own reasoning to kind of derive what to do. So this is why in Sunni traditional Islam, this is what ends up happening. Lastly, I would say that the hadith does become, I would argue, like just like you have the oral and the written and the oral Torah, you do see a similar phenomenon. So here's Judith Romney Wegner in an article on Islamic and Talmudic jurisprudence. She sees the parallel between Islamic Sunnah and Jewish Mishnah, and she notes that the Muslim jurists, the early Muslim jurists themselves noticed this. And you have Jonathan Brown, who is a Western academic. He teaches at Georgetown University. He has written a lot of books on hadith, which I strongly recommend. And he's somebody who's extremely sympathetic to hadith. But he's actually, I think, one of the best defenders of hadith in the Western Academy. He says, when someone asks, what does Islam say about something? They often say, well, let's look at what the Quran says about it. But he says, the Quran is not really the source to which a curious reader should refer to. Instead, it is the Sunnah. And for all practical purposes, this is carried through the hadith. And he himself compares the hadith to the oral Torah, which transmitted the authoritative interpreters of the written Torah and was set down in written form in the Mishnah, which kind of brings us full circle to the quote by Caliph Umar. And finally, I bring you to Javed Ahmad Ghamdi's view in the present day. Again, the purpose of this course is to contextualize contemporary debates. So I'm just going to quickly read this, and I know we're going a few minutes over time, I apologize. But this is in the handbook, the Wiley Handbook of Hadith. We have Javed Ahmad Ghamdi's view on this that is reported. Ghamidi has developed a very specific and systematic theory pertaining to the definition of Sunnah that is both epistemologically and methodologically independent of Hadith. So he decouples Sunnah and Hadith. Ghamidi equates the concept of Sunnah with that of the Millet of Ibrahim, by which the Millah Ibrahim, which he refers to, which refers to the religious traditions of the faith of Prophet Abraham, that is, of the past prophets. The Sunnah is more of this open term that refers to, and again, and we saw that, remember when we were talking about David and Solomon. Furthermore, he argues that the religious practices have reached us through this in actu, bodily perpetuations of numerous individuals, this transmission of knowledge, and not written or oral sources such as the Hadith. The Hadith is not an independent source of legal authority in his view. Ghamidi's approach rejects the widely established theory of dual revelation, whereby Sunnah derived from authentic Hadith reports is a form of unrecited revelation, or the legal maxim that of classical Islam that the Sunnah rules over the Quran, and that the Quran does not rule over the Sunnah, and that the book, the Quran, often takes only general sentences which the Hadith then specifies. On the contrary, he says, the Hadith need to be interpreted in light of the Quran and cannot change or modify the Quran in any way. Now, my own view, I came to this from an academic perspective. Before I knew of Mr. Ghamidi, I came through this through my exposure to Professor Fazl Rahman, which we talked about last week, but Professor Rahman has a similar concept of Sunnah as a dynamic concept that historically underwent changes from first being associated with just general ethical behavioral norms of the Prophet, and then became more fixed into Hadith units. So we formerly had this dynamic living Sunnah, and now it got restricted to kind of Hadith, solitary Hadith reports. Okay, finally, here are some sources for you, and then I'm going to take questions, and I don't mind staying late. I apologize for those people who have to leave. Again, I refer you to Asma Afsaruddin's book, The First Muslims, for that early history. I do think this is slightly slanted towards the Sunni perspective, although I agree with it. I am Sunni myself, so I mean, at least I come from a Sunni background, so we will go through some Shia sources next class. God's Caliph is a good book, might be too technical for some people. Then there's Halak's books on Islamic law. This one is the introduction. I think this is a good place to start. He has some more advanced books that you can go to after that. Then we have Ahmad al-Shamsi's book on the canonization of Islamic law. This is excellent. We have Hadith as scripture. That's talking about how Hadith is kind of elevated to a level of scripture alongside the Quran. We have Jonathan Brown's books on Hadith. So he has this book, and he also has Misquoting Muhammad. I recommend both of these books. He has a book that, his books are more sympathetic towards Hadith and the Hadith enterprise. So I absolutely want you to expand your thinking and not just take kind of the Hadith skeptical or cautious views. You should expand yourself and read all sorts of different views. So I recommend you read Professor Brown's book. There's Benam Siddiqui's book on Islamic law. Then he's talking about how Islamic law even circumvented text, and we'll talk about that in the deep dive. And finally, just a general book. This is also a book on Sharia law by Kamali. This is also a very sympathetic book towards the traditional Islamic interpretation. So keep that in mind when you read that book. Thank you, and let's take some questions. Whoever needs to leave, I apologize for going over time. So we have a question from Usman. Usman, go ahead, please unmute your mic and go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, for giving me a chance to ask the question. Actually, I'm interested to know a little bit more about the nature of personal school. Oriental scholar Shah, who talked about ancient school before the genesis of doctrinal school, as well as George Makdisi, another expert of learning tradition in Islamic history, talked about local schools. I wanted to ask that the local schools and ancient schools are similar to personal school, or there is a difference, and the personal school is different in nature and essence. Please clarify this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So yes, what he is talking about are the personal and local schools. So first you have personal schools, and then you have local schools. So what Shakh was really talking about, if I've understood him correctly, is he's trying to make sure that we appreciate the difference between the doctrinal schools that are become like kind of transnational sort of, and those are the four madhabs we think about today. And really, initially they started as local phenomenon that started first with the person and then with the local area. So definitely in Iraq, you see people of opinion forming. In Medina, you have that Maliki idea forming. And it's only later that they're codified and become what we think of now as the Maliki school and the Hanafi school, etc. So I think that that's what he's going toward. I hope that answered your question. All right, so I have some questions here. All right. Okay, so we answered the question about the Quran's compilation as best as I could. Okay, the question is from Mr. Basit Qari. Is it fair to refer to Hanafis as rationalists while the label is normally used for Mu'tazila? Okay, so the word rationalists, even some of my colleagues in the academy would have an issue of even translating Mu'tazila as rationalists. And the basis for that is they would argue that even the Ash'aris were rationalists in a certain way, at least. I tend to lean on the side of just simplifying, especially when I'm talking to a non-academic audience. I tend to just say Islamic rationalists. So it is a shorthand term that I use. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the Hanafis themselves, Mu'tazilis and Hanafis, we need to understand, Hanafi is a legal school. These are legal schools. Mu'tazili is a theological school, a school of kalam. So you can absolutely be a Hanafi Mu'tazili. And in fact, the Hanafi school had many Mu'tazilis in it. So, and that's why it had this rational bent. So I would take your question, I would heed what you say and say that using the word rationalist for the Hanafis or even the Mu'tazilis, it's fraught with controversy, and it is just a shorthand term that I use. I would say that the Hanafis started out more rationalistic and with time became less rationalistic, and that the Mu'tazilis eventually pretty much died off, and so Hanafis were no longer Mu'tazilis whatsoever. So that's how I would answer that question. I hope I did justice to that. Okay, the next question is from Umar Ahmad. Why was Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal imprisoned? Is it because of the Mu'tazilis? Yes, the Caliph became a Mu'tazili, and he wanted to enforce Mu'tazili doctrine on the Quran, and the idea that the Quran is created, and he made scholars basically conform to this view, and if they didn't, they would be prevented from teaching or they would be jailed. So that is why Imam Ahmad was imprisoned, and that's also what led to him becoming a hero and an icon for the people of the tradition, the traditionists. Hope that answered that question. And we're going to talk about that controversy in much more detail, but in the next class, in a future class. But it was the controversy about whether the Quran is a created or uncreated text. All right. Question from Muhammad Ali. Can we get a clarification on this from Muhammad Ali? Is Muhammad Ali, are you still here? Can you ask this on verbal chat? If not. Okay, Muhammad Ali, if you want to raise your hand, and then I'm going to call on you next. But I'll look at this question that's from Mr. Nadeem. Quran was meant for all times and people and intentionally vague so its teachings could be applied within social and cultural context with some specific rulings that were timeless. Hadiths, by virtue of being specific, don't they limit themselves to the particular time and place? So again, this is excellent question. Thank you. This is obviously a religious question in the sense of you're pretty much asking me what my religious leanings are. I think you can read between the lines and discern that, yes, I do lean in the same direction that you're leaning. And I do think that's precisely why traditionists were such big fans of hadiths, was because they were so skeptical and cautious of human reasoning. They wanted to limit human reasoning. They thought it was too subjective and people would use their whims and desires and be led astray. So because of that, That's why they stressed hadith. And that's why the Islamic rationalists, the Mu'tazilis, were very hadith skeptical and minimized hadith. Some of them rejected hadith completely. Most of them, however, wanted to minimize hadith. So I agree with you. So if you base a lot of your viewpoint on being stringent with hadiths and making that the founding block, you cut off space for human reasoning and contextualization in the present day. Although that's my view. Somebody who is of the other hadith traditionist view, and those are the traditionalists who come in the present day, they would push back against that severely, and they would say, look, Islam is for all times and all societies, and we should stay consistent as opposed to adjusting our view for our specific context. All right. Any last questions, or are we good now? Okay. I think that'll wrap us up. We were only 15 minutes late, so that's good. Thank you so much. Again, please do donate. And lastly, please do, okay, I said this at the beginning of the talk, so I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of vertigo. But I'm gonna upload 2 deep dives on YouTube, so please don't miss that. And it'll be about hadith, women's prayer, all sorts of controversial stuff that I'm sure you'll find interesting. And then finally, make sure to go to that classroom.google.com, join the classroom, there's that code, and that will allow you to be in conversation with me. And I'm gonna upload my notes, my PowerPoint, my keynotes on that. Thank you so much. Ramadan Mubarak. And thank you again for the Ghamidi team and the Ghamidi Center team. And thank you all for joining me.